It is my distinct privilege to introduce someone who can tell us what is working in Florida and around our nation. I was just in Florida myself for a conference of the Chief Justices, and I spoke on a panel about eyewitness identification and its role in wrongful convictions. And for the meeting, the Chief Justices who attended all read a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about wrongful convictions in the state of Florida that helped me to really understand what a long haul it is to bend that arc of the moral universe toward justice. Judge Steve Leifman from the 11th Judicial Circuit Court of Florida will describe his experiences working with people with mental illness as they come into our criminal justice system. The problems that his community faces will sound familiar to all of you. Large populations of people with mental illness, public safety officers being the primary responders, and what the criminal justice system can do to provide a safer, more effective, and more humane response. Judge Leifman is a wonderful example of a problem-solving judge who has applied leadership and innovation to a community problem that we are facing here in Oregon. So please join me in welcoming Judge Steve Leifman.
Thank you, Chief. Good afternoon. I know it's been a long day. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here, and Chief Justice, thank you for your commitment to this issue. It makes a world of difference in helping communities fix a very fixable but complex and vexing problem. I will tell you that when I became a judge, I had no idea I was actually becoming the gatekeeper to Florida's largest psychiatric facility. And sadly, that is, or was, the Miami-Dade County Jail. While the United States has 5% of the world's population, we have 25% of the world's inmates. Think about that a moment. 1 out of every 4 inmates in the world is housed in the United States. As we sit here this afternoon, 1 in 104 adults in the United States are behind bars. 1 in 33 adults in the United States are under correctional supervision. Since 1980, the number of people going to jail in this country has tripled, and their sentences have increased by 166%. And as you drill down deeper, what you will find is much of this is due to untreated mental illnesses and untreated substance use disorders. In fact, people with mental illnesses in this country are 9 times more likely to be incarcerated than hospitalized. They're 18 times more likely to find a bed in the criminal justice system than at any state civil hospital. Annually, we have almost 2 million people with serious mental illnesses arrested, and on any given day, there are about 550,000 people with serious mental illnesses behind bars and another 900,000 under correctional supervision. 40% of all people with serious mental illnesses at some point in their life will come into contact with the criminal justice system. This is a shameful American tragedy and is one that can and must be reversed. And on a financial side, it is equally horrifying. Last year, collectively, the counties in the United States spent over $80 billion on correctional costs. It's getting so bad for some counties that they're having to decide, do I build a new hospital or a new jail? Do I build a new road or a new jail? Do I build a new school or a new jail? And our states are spending an additional $71 billion on prison. I'd like to start with a short video that will do a great job. I don't see my videographer. I hope he didn't disappear. There he is. I'm going to start with a short video that does a wonderful job describing our situation in Miami.
Now, live, this is CBS 4 News at 11.
Life here is dirty, deplorable, dangerous. Tonight, CBS 4 takes you to a place cameras are rarely allowed to reveal what's happening in our downtown jail to the inmates on the forgotten floor.
The people who spend their days and nights in these jail cells all suffer from mental illness. They're accused criminals, not guilty in the eyes of the law, but forced to live in conditions you cannot imagine.
Our chief investigative reporter, Michelle Gillen, has been given unprecedented television access to reveal what's going on. Michelle joins us now, and I was shocked, to say the least, when I saw this.
I think certainly it is time for the public to see what is going on. The pictures you are about to see are indeed haunting and most disturbing. Hundreds of men with mental illnesses, many crammed into tiny cells. Some arrested for minor crimes that advocates say would have the average person out of jail in just hours. But incredibly, there is no place to send them. Tonight, our cameras take you inside a world rarely exposed, the forgotten floor.
And then they get thrown into a cell.
I can't breathe, they can't.
Prison insiders call this the forgotten floor, but it seems unimaginable that the horrendous, be it horrifying conditions of a jail spilling over with inmates suffering from mental illnesses could be erased from any sane man's mind. As frigid air is pumped into sealed cells, some beg for help for the barest of necessities, water. The faucets are dry. The water's not working.
The water's not working. He's drinking sewer water. He's drinking toilet water out of the toilet.
We'll get you water. It doesn't work, the faucets. The faucets aren't working. These stench-filled cells were designed for one person, outfitted with only a single steel shelf for a bed.
In this one, there's 3 inmates in a cell for one.
Yet 2, 3, sometimes even 5 men diagnosed with mental illnesses, in most cases arrested for low-level felony crimes, in some cases misdemeanors, are locked up for days, weeks, months. Tell me about you. Tell me, living in this, what do you want the public to know tonight?
I want the public to know that people in here, they're urinating on the floor, and we have to sleep on top of it. They're defecating on the floor, and you have to sleep on top of it. There's only one bunker that's made of steel.
And how many people are in your cell?
There is 4 in here right now.
They are only allowed out of their cell for 15 minutes 2 times a week.
30 minutes a week they're allowed out.
So other than a half an hour,
That's it.
this is it. They
Right.
are in this room.
Lights are on 24/7. The conditions you see just do not change.
I've been in Vietnam. I've been in Vietnam after 18 months of Vietnam. It's worse conditions in here. I wouldn't put a dog in here.
A chilling perspective from the jail's chief psychiatrist, Dr. Joseph Portier.
You would think that in 2006, we would treat people with chronic mental illness in a much better, more humane manner. But unfortunately, we're reverting back to how it was in the 16 and 1700s, which is terrible. It's morally incomprehensible.
A sentiment echoed by an outraged Miami-Dade County judge, Steve Leifman.
This is like a secret that people don't know about.
It's a bad secret, and it's a sad secret.
What most of you don't know is that the Miami-Dade jail now serves as the largest psychiatric facility in the state of Florida. 3 of 9 floors, burgeoning with inmates suffering from mental illnesses, and according to Leifman, in desperate need of treatment. Not this type of confinement designed to punish people.
5 times as many people in our jail with mental illness than any psychiatric hospital in Florida. 5 times.
In this, right here.
Right here.
An elderly man emerges from the dirt and darkness.
There's one on the floor underneath the bunk and 1 or 2 standing around waiting for their turn to sleep.
And the crisis has unfolded across the state. In other Florida jails where they strive to comply with all the national standards for housing inmates, frustration over the virtual abandonment of mentally ill inmates left by the state to languish in jail cells for months runs deep. Colonel David Parrish.
Can you imagine the chaos that would result in the local criminal justice system if I stood at the booking door and said, sorry, we don't have any more room, we're not taking them from you, law enforcement?
Yeah. Parrish from Hillsborough County says local authorities had no choice but to sue the state of Florida to force the Department of Children and Families to comply with their legal mandate to transfer mentally ill inmates to a treatment facility within 15 days.
Jails should not be the de facto mental health facility for a county, but that's what they are in the United States.
You had your birthday here. How old were you?
I was 21.
21.
Yes, ma'am.
And you've been here 8 months.
In Pinellas County, the weight of incarcerating and caring for mentally ill inmates had everyone paying a price, an unacceptable one, according to Major Kirk Brunner.
We are not a treatment facility, and these people that you saw in Delta 1, the one that plucked his eye out, they need to be in a treatment facility, which is the responsibility of the state, not our responsibility.
And therein lies the danger. William Weaver Sr. was caring for his 40-year-old son Bill at home, a son he says suffered from schizophrenia but functioned well for decades until his medicine was changed. Then one night, according to police records, he attacked his elderly father, who called police and urged them to arrest his son, hoping this would trigger treatment.
Because he was under the false idea that if he got arrested, he'd get treatment.
Bill ended up locked up in a cell on floor 9 of the Miami-Dade Pretrial Detention Center for several months. According to authorities, Bill jumped from this top bunk bed, cracking his skull and breaking his neck. He's now a quadriplegic who needs hospitalization to stay alive. We met up with his father, who had just left his hospital bed.
Do you think anything has come from what the incident of what your son went through?
Nothing. Nothing's changed. Do I think something could change? I don't know. I don't know. It's time. It's time something changed. But I don't know if it ever will.
Tragically, the young man in the video passed away as a result of his injuries, and we believe shortly thereafter his father passed away, probably from a broken heart. It took us 11 years, but things do change. We closed that horrible 9th floor and opened up a more appropriate facility in our jail for people with mental illnesses, but the answer is not building better jails for people with mental illnesses. It's building better systems of care so people with mental illnesses never come into contact with the criminal justice system. My journey into the mental health world began one morning when I was getting ready to go on the bench. At the time, I was handling a misdemeanor jail division, which had 3 kinds of people: those with attached felonies who were not allowed out, those that were too poor to bond out, and those with mental illnesses that just didn't know how to get out. So I was approached by the assistant public defender and the assistant state attorney, and they asked me if I would speak to a couple whose son was in jail on a case I was about to hear. I think it was in on some silly charge. I'm not even sure if it was a statutory offense. It may have been a local county ordinance like possession of a dairy cart, which a lot of homeless people often got swept up in. So the lovely couple came into my chambers. They were very sophisticated and very distraught. The mom was crying, the dad was shaking, and they literally began to beg me to get their son help. They told me that their son was brilliant. He had gone to Harvard. He had a late onset of schizophrenia, and he was now homeless and recycling through the criminal system, and they just didn't know what to do. I was relatively new at the time, and I think when you're a new judge, you think you have a lot more power and a lot more wisdom than you really do. And I made the mistake of promising them that I would get their son help, because I was under this false impression. You know, we deal in logic. And I knew that, God forbid, you got arrested and you had a heart attack, we had a system of care that we would take you into and you would be treated. And I just assumed if you got arrested and you had some serious mental illness, we must have a system of care to take care of you as well, because at the time in Florida, judges had absolutely no training on what to do with people with mental illnesses. So as I started to go back into the courtroom, the mom stopped me and said, "Judge, there's one more thing I need to tell you about my son." She said, "Not only is he brilliant, but respectfully, he probably knows more about the mental health system than you do." I looked at her. I wasn't quite sure what she was trying to tell me. And she said, you see, my son, he's the former head of psychiatry at Jackson Memorial Hospital, our largest public hospital in Florida. He didn't show up to work one day, she told me. He had this late onset of schizophrenia. He was having ideations that God was talking to him, so he cashed in his life insurance policy and got on an airplane and flew to Israel. And within a couple weeks, the Israelis deported him because he was running around naked in the Jerusalem Orthodox section of Israel. And for his own safety, they sent him back home. I was pretty taken back. I went into the courtroom and I called his case, and he stood, and we started to have an amazing conversation. He was coherent, he was thoughtful, he was more respectful than the lawyers, and I'm thinking, maybe something's wrong with his folks. He seems pretty good to me. Except when you looked at him, he looked like he hadn't showered or bathed in months. He kept insisting there was absolutely nothing wrong with him. He had no type of mental health disorder. And if I would only release him, he would go see a psychiatrist, get evaluated, and come back. And in his own words, he said, look, Judge, I'm in on this ridiculous charge. I didn't even do it, but even if I did, I would have been out by now, and you really need these beds for really serious offenders. He was right. I said, can I ask you a question? He said, sure, Your Honor, anything. I said, I just don't understand one thing. You keep insisting there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. But if that's the case, why would a Harvard-educated psychiatrist be in jail, be homeless, and recycling through the criminal justice system? All of a sudden, he got a look on his face that I will not forget to the day I die. It was a look of sheer terror and fear. And all of a sudden, he started cupping his ears. He started rocking back and forth, and he started screaming at the top of his lungs. And he started pointing to the back of the courtroom where his parents were standing, and everything he screamed was in sixes, and he started yelling, Your Honor, Your Honor, Your Honor, you have to have the culprit removed, you have to have the culprit removed, you have to have the culprit removed. I said to him, aren't those your parents? No, 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 no. Real parents, real parents, real parents, real parents, died. Holocaust, 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 Holocaust. And they're from the CIA, 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 and they came to kill me, kill me, kill me, kill me, kill me. And the only thing at that moment you could hear in my courtroom was his poor mother crying. I did the only thing that I had been taught, which was by the judge whose division I had taken over. She said, hey, if they act strange or bizarre, that was her quote, not mine, order a psychological evaluation. I wasn't even sure what I was supposed to do with the evaluation when it came back. I immediately ordered a psychological evaluation. I don't know, now he's in jail 4-6 weeks on possession of a dairy cart. The evaluation came back. It said not only was he incompetent to stand trial, but he even met criteria for Florida's involuntary commitment law, which is a really high criteria. I'm thinking this is great. I'm going to be a hero. I'm going to get this guy help. I need 2 more evaluations to get a stipulation. I order 2 more, 10, 12 weeks, possession of a dairy cart. All 3 evaluations come back. All say he's incompetent. All say he meets criteria. This is great. I give it to the lawyers. They immediately stipulate. I begin to order him into involuntary hospitalization, which I had no idea what that really meant. I look down. The assistant public defender has a grin on her face. As a former assistant public defender, I know this is a really bad sign. She then utters those magic words to the judge, which judges really can't stand. She says, Your Honor, in all due respect, because we know it has nothing to do with respect. You can laugh. We know it's true. That's how they tell us we're idiots and we don't know what we're doing without going to jail. And I said, excuse me? And she whips out a Florida Supreme Court opinion, which had just come out 2 months earlier, that said county court judges, of which I am, have absolutely no legal authority to involuntarily commit anybody. That my only option was to do what this doctor had told me 8 weeks earlier, was to release him, have him evaluated, and come back. Little footnote in the case says, we know this isn't a great opinion. We strongly urge the Florida legislature to address this issue. That was in January of 2000. I finally got a bill introduced today. that might address this issue. And as much as I didn't like the law, I am sworn to uphold it, and I released him back to the street. Floridly psychotic, meeting criteria of imminent dangerousness to self or others. Not only did I not fulfill the promise I made his parents, I put him at risk, I put the community at risk, I probably put my job at risk, God forbid something happened to him or he did something to someone else, but I followed the law. I went back to my chambers pretty upset that morning. I got on the phone and I learned 3 very valuable lessons. The first lesson I learned is it turns out Miami-Dade County truly does have a serious mental health crisis. As it turns out, we have 2 to 3 times the national average of people with serious mental illnesses in my community. 9.1% of my general population, that's 197,000 adults and 55,000 children, live in my community with very serious illnesses, when only 1%, because we're 49th per capita, you're not 50th, so congratulations. 49th per capita, so only 1% of my population was even getting access to care, which made my jail the largest psychiatric facility in my state. I also learned that 35% of our inmates were on antipsychotic medication and that we were spending $500,000 a day. That's $180 million a year to warehouse people in that hellhole you saw on the video. And because conditions are not conducive in my jail, like most jails for treatment, people in my jail and yours, on average, stay 4 to 8 times longer with a serious mental illness than someone without a mental illness with the exact same charge at 7 times the cost. And because we had done a horrible job training our law enforcement on how to even address this problem, we've had more than 25 people with serious mental illnesses die during an encounter with the police because the police were not sufficiently trained or prepared either. That was my first lesson. The second lesson I learned that day is that this was not just a local problem or a state problem, but as it turns out, it is a national problem as well. Former Surgeon General David Satcher calls mental illness the silent epidemic of our times. If you work in the criminal justice system like all of us do in this room, there is nothing silent about the epidemic. We hear their screams and cries every single day. And the third lesson, the one most difficult to swallow, is that our community mental health systems, our crisis system and laws are antiquated, fragmented, do not reflect modern science, research, and medicine, and are in great, great need of reform. I've come to a very simple conclusion after doing this almost 19 years, that if we treated people with primary health issues the way we treated people with mental illnesses, not only would there be a plethora of civil lawsuits, there would probably be indictments for gross negligence. What other illness is it permissible to discharge people floridly psychotic in the middle of the night, not give them what they need, and then arrest them when they don't behave the way we need them to behave, when we haven't offered them the services to begin with? You know, I took my dog to the vet recently. Great dog, not a big deal, little thing, on a Saturday, because of course they're open Saturday, but find a mental health provider who is. No big deal, I take him in, take him home, he's fine. Monday morning, before I go to work, the phone rings. It's the vet, they wanted to know how my dog was doing. Good luck if you have a mental illness getting a follow-up call to see how your patient is doing. If you'd indulge me for one moment, I want to read from an article on mental health I reviewed recently that I believe is very telling and very interesting. The past few years have seen an increasing amount of interest manifested in mental health and psychiatry. The existing laws treat people with mental illnesses as a criminal instead of a person who is ill. Booking a person at a police department with mental illness is unnecessary and undesirable. Police officers should be replaced by trained representatives of hospitals to effect the transfer of patients from their home to the hospital or from one hospital to another. All laws concerning mental illness should be integrated to eliminate inefficiency and duplication. In the past, psychiatry has suffered because of its isolation from general medicine. Integrating psychiatry into the general practice of medicine is in line with modern trends of medical education and hospital practice. The article goes on and talks about the importance importance and necessity of community education and how we need to educate parents and children and teachers and doctors and judges and jurors, clergy, employers, employees, and the public in general. And these are just a few of the comments and recommendations that were published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in January 1939. 80 years ago. We know better. It is so sad and tragic that when it comes to developing systems and funding that are appropriate for people with mental illnesses, frankly, we have lost ground, and in some ways, we are worse off today than we were 80 years ago. I'm just going to give you a short history lesson because I think it's telling on how we're going to get out of this mess. But when our country was first founded, we didn't know what to do with people with mental illnesses. So generally, they were arrested and they were locked up, not on crimes, but they were put in jails. And it remained this way until the early 1800s when this wonderful woman, Dorothea Dix, was visiting a jail in Boston. And she came across these 14 men that were segregated from the rest of the jail, and there was no heat, and this was in the dead of winter, and they were literally freezing to death. So she went to the jailer and said, "Excuse me, who are these men, and why are you treating them this way?" And he's like, "Look, lady," and this is his term, not mine, "they're just a bunch of lunatics. And they, ironically, he says, they didn't commit any crime, so I'm not even getting paid to keep them here." So he's murdering them for crying out loud. So this one woman, this one person is so outraged, she adopts a movement that had begun in Paris called moral treatment. And she goes to the Massachusetts legislature and she convinces them to build an asylum. And there's supposed to be these small 120-bed asylums. And she's going to take people out of the jail and put them in programs and facilities that would be more appropriate. What's smart thinking for 1840? And it worked. People started to get better because now we know what trauma does to people. And asylums built all over the country, and people were leaving jail and moving into these asylums. Well, we know our states. Having a bunch of 120-bed facilities isn't really efficient. So let's combine them. Let's consolidate them. And they started to build these massive, massive hospitals. There was one in Georgia that had 10,000, 15,000 people, one in Ohio, 10,000, 15,000 people, and they became these human experimentation facilities. No oversight, no regulations. For instance, they found that a lot of the folks with mental illnesses at these facilities had slightly elevated blood sugar levels, so the geniuses of the time said, they're diabetics, that's what's causing their insanity. So they went around, started giving insulin shock treatment to everybody at these facilities. Well, they weren't diabetic, people got sick, they died. They crossed that one off the list and said, shocking seems to help though. They developed this thing, an electric shock therapy machine. They'd put them in a room, put a piece of stick in their mouth so they wouldn't bite off their tongues. They'd put a couple electrodes on their head, stick it in an outlet, and shock the living hell out of them. And then when that didn't work, some guy who I think thought he was a doctor by the name of Friedman developed something called the Friedman pick. And when all failed, they'd take the pick and they'd punch it behind your eye and they would do a lobotomy. And believe it or not, this went on into the late 1970s. This isn't 100 years ago. You can understand why people with mental illnesses are so scared and nervous to go get treatment. It hasn't been a good, kind system. Well, in what would become his last public bill signing, in 1963, President Kennedy signed this wonderful National Community Mental Health Act. A lot of people don't know this, but his sister Rose had serious mental illness, went through a lobotomy, which was butchered, and lived a very tortured life. So the Kennedys were very sensitive to the issue. So President Kennedy signs this $3 billion authorizing act, and the idea is to take people from these hospitals that really were cruel and unusual and return them into the community with community-based care. The first medications that come out, of course, oversold as a cure, and everyone was excited. He signs this act. Well, tragically, due to the president's assassination and the escalation of the Vietnam War, not one penny of the $3 billion gets appropriated. But at the same time, a whole slew of lawsuits get filed, and a major case comes out of the great state of Alabama and ends up in front of this brilliant judge, Judge Johnson. And actually, the case was filed by the doctors because Alabama was going to cut off a tax on cigarettes that was funding their hospital, and the docs were worried about losing their jobs. So he ends up in front of Judge Johnson. He takes one look at the case, and he throws out the first part of the pleadings, and he says, "You're SOL," you know, that great legal term. And he says, "Look, I can't tell Alabama who to hire and fire, but And clearly Judge Johnson was looking for a case. He reaches in and he grabs jurisdiction and he says, you have the most grotesque, horrific state hospital in the United States. I mean, it was really horrible. And he says, you have to make 80 specific changes, and if you don't make all specific changes, I'm shutting you down. And I think Judge Johnson thought if he threatened Alabama that he would release these people back to the street, Alabama would cough up the money necessary to improve the conditions. And what this case stands for is we already knew at that point, if you were in jail, you had a constitutional right to adequate health care. And he extends that constitutional right to state civil hospitals. Well, the states now have two choices. They could spend the billions of dollars which are going to be needed to clean up these facilities, or they could release this population and give them community treatment. Well, we all know what happened next. They closed them as quick as they can because they wanted to save the money. But there was a problem. President Kennedy's Community Mental Health Act never got funded. So in 1955, there were 560,000 people in state hospitals. If nothing had changed and we kept people in hospitals, which I'm not advocating, we don't need to do, but just to give you some context, there'd be about 1.5 million people in state hospitals. Today, there are less than 30,000 civil hospital beds left in this country. Yet, last year, 1.5 million people and 2 million incidents with serious mental illnesses were arrested. Almost the exact number of people who would have been in state hospitals had nothing changed. So we never deinstitutionalized. What we did is we transferred responsibility from these really horrible, crappy hospitals to these really horrible, crappy jails. Except in some ways we've made it worse. Because now not only do you have to deal with the stigma of having a serious mental illness, now you have to deal with the stigma of having mental illness in a criminal, making it harder to get employment, making it harder to get a job, making it more likely you're going to hang out and meet new friends that are going to teach you some really bad new skills. And the sadder and maybe more cruel irony to this story is that 200 years plus have passed and jails are now once again the primary place for people with mental illnesses in this country. We have, with all the wonderful advances and civil rights gains we've made in this country, this is the one area we have lost ground and we have failed people with mental illnesses miserably. And the consequences have been clear. We've seen homelessness increase, police injuries increase, police shootings of people with mental illnesses increase. We've wasted critical tax dollars, and in many ways we've made mental illness a crime in this nation. In fact, in my own state, our police actually initiate more involuntary examinations than the total number of arrests that they make for robbery, burglary, and grand theft auto combined. And if this didn't bother you enough, the economic impact should. So when we started our project in Miami, we wanted to see if we could wrap our arms around the people that were accessing mental health and criminal justice services the most. And so we have this great institute at the University of South Florida, but being typical Florida, it's not in South Florida, it's in Tampa. But it's the University of South Florida, and they have this amazing institute where they have these blended data sets of all the arrests in Florida, all the involuntary commitments in Florida, Medicaid and Medicare records. And they can actually tell a community who the highest utilizers of criminal justice and mental health services are. So we sent them the names of thousands of people that had been arrested in Miami-Dade over 5 years that we knew had a mental health disorder. We sent it off. I wait. I'm thinking, okay, they'll narrow it down maybe to 1,000 people. That'll be a great place for us to start our project. And at least we'll be able to wrap our arms around a subset of the people we should be focusing on. Finally, after months, a letter arrives, not an email letter, very thin letter. Kind of reminded me of my college applications. I open it up, and there's one piece of paper. And on this one piece of paper are the names of 97 people. Primarily men, primarily diagnosed with schizoaffective schizophrenia, primarily homeless, and primarily co-occurring, who over a 5-year period were arrested 2,200 times, spent 27,000 days in that lovely jail you saw in the video, 13,000 days in a psychiatric crisis unit or ER, and cost taxpayers conservatively $13.7 million, and we got absolutely nothing for it. We joke, but it's true. We would have been better off sending them to Harvard. It would have been cheaper, they would have gotten an education, they would have had housing, and they would have been much better off than what we ended up doing, which is nothing but make them worse. And then competency. My great state. Now, Washington is leading the way in an error, and hopefully you're not going to get caught in the same mistake. My state at least requires that once you're adjudicated incompetent, the state has 15 days to move you from jail to a restoration facility. But that video was made because my state decided that they wanted to ignore the law. And so we had people backing up in the jail. It produced a lawsuit. Our Secretary of Department of Children and Families was found in criminal contempt of court, was about to go to jail. She was fined $81,000. The legislature had a meet in special session. They allocated immediate 16 plus 68 million more dollars to rent 300 beds, because that's what this nightmare cost, and did nothing to fix the problem. So that's when the Chief Justice reached down, asked me to get involved, and asked me to take a look what was going on, and what we found was startling. My state spends 22%, at the time it was 30%, 22% of its entire adult mental health budget, $144 million, to restore competency for about 3,000 people a year, when at the same time, we have between 120 and 130,000 people in Florida who at the time of their arrest need acute care mental health care treatment. Competency restoration is a constitutional entitlement, because everyone is entitled to a fair trial under the Fifth Amendment. And so the states have no choice but to pay for restoration. No such entitlement exists for community treatment. So where do you think my state looks for the money to fund the entitlement? Because we're Florida, there's a reason. And by the way, you're welcome. You better spend my Medicaid expansion dollars really well, because we're so generous in Florida that we decided to give you $52 billion of our dollars for your Medicaid expansion. We're a generous state. But it's a problem. So they take the money from the community mental health system to fund the entitled system of restoration, ironically making it harder for people to get access to treatment and pushing more people in the criminal justice system, and they can't understand why it continues to grow. And then there's prison. While most prisons, and I met your wonderful Department of Corrections Secretary last night, your numbers have finally started to level out of your general prison population, so have ours. But like you and like us, not the mental health population, that is continuously going like this. So over the last 12 years in Florida, we've started to level out, but people with mental illnesses have grown by 178%. And if it keeps growing at this rate, if we don't intervene and start to do new strategies, Florida's going to need to build 10 new prisons over the next 10 years just to house the increase of people with mental illnesses. And by the way, they're not committing heinous offenses. The average stay for a person in prison in Florida with mental illness is only 2.5 to 4 years. They're just accumulating points because they're committing all these quality of life offenses. Well, the cost to build and operate 10 new prisons in Florida over 10 years is $2.5 billion. There is something wrong with a society that's willing to spend more money to incarcerate people that are ill than to treat them. So where do we start? The problem is there's no switch to flip. This requires a county-by-county change, and that's what makes it a little complicated. There's a wonderful national initiative called Stepping Up. It's a collaboration between the National Association of Counties, the Council of State Governments, and the American Psychiatric Association Foundation that is working with the communities to help people flip that switch to figure out how to fix this problem, because I'm here to tell you it is fixable. And while judges are becoming more and more involved in this issue, the reality is none of us can fix this problem alone. Not one person, not one party, not one institution created this problem, and not one person, party, or institution is going to fix it. This truly takes a true collaboration to fix this issue. And while there were many, many years in my community that we had a dysfunctional system, we really didn't start to tackle it until 2000. After I had this horrible situation with the psychiatrist, fortuitously, the first national meeting of this issue was in Miami. And I went there, it was like a religious revival. It was like the first time I was hearing real answers to real problems with real solutions. And being a judge, it's good to beg. And I begged them to give me a grant, to send me some experts, so that we could have a summit and we could start to figure out what in the heck was going on. And so they sent me 3 wonderful, wonderful experts. And I told my audience this morning at my breakout, I learned that day the real definition of an expert. It's someone that lives 15 miles outside your jurisdiction. Because we had been talking for months what a horrible problem we had, but it wasn't until the experts came in and told us we had a problem that all of a sudden everyone realized we really had a problem. And I actually brought someone from Seattle, which is as far away as you could get from Miami, so he was an amazing expert. And what we did is we spent the first half day, and I really encourage everyone to do this, where we mapped out how our criminal justice system intersects with our community mental health system. And the nice thing about being a judge is when we invite people to a meeting, they come even if they don't want to be there. So I invited all these traditional and non-traditional important people that could make policy changes, and they showed up. And I know this is true because when I was an assistant public defender and I was the acting chief of the county court division, I started to notice this big uptick in the number of clients that we had with serious mental illness because, of course, it turned out the local state hospital had been shut down and no one told us. So I sent out a letter and I invited all these important, sane people to the meeting. And not only did no one not show up to my meeting, they didn't even have the decency to tell me they weren't coming. So a couple years later, I got appointed. I had this horrible situation with the psychiatrist. I took the same letter. I put it on my new stationery with the gold seal. They were there early. And so we mapped out this system, and I remember looking at each other and saying, who's more sick? These poor folks with serious mental illnesses or us so-called policy types that designed a system to fail? The judges were judging, police policing, prosecutor prosecuting, defender defending, and one person with a serious mental illness was accessing the services of everybody in that room, not just once, again and again and again. And so we came up with a cooperative agreement, and we came up with a wonderful goal, which was that diversion and linkages to healthcare makes jail the last resort. And we put down these ideas, and we came up with the time of a 2-part approach. If I were to do it again, it would be a 3-part approach, which I'll mention in a minute. We looked around the country, and clearly to us, the best pre-arrest approach was the Memphis Crisis Intervention Teen Police Program. Except the difference between Memphis and Miami is about 2.8 million people. And they had 1 department, we have 36. And so we started slow. We had a lot of resistance from law enforcement. I guess they didn't want some civilian judge that knew nothing about their jobs to tell them what to do. But after a lot of learning, a grand jury report or 2, they really came around, and now they are our heroes. We now have the largest trained squad of CIT officers in the United States. I have over 6,500 police officers trained at all 36 departments. We keep data on every single call the 2 largest agencies make, which is the City of Miami and Miami-Dade County. And over the last 8 years, they handled 83,427 mental health calls. And out of those 83,000, those are only the 2 out of 36 departments. Out of those 83,427 calls, remarkably, they only made, and listen carefully, 149 arrests. The number of arrests in Dade County, yeah, they deserve all the praise in the world. Between the post-arrest, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, and the pre-arrest, the number of arrests in Dade County went from 118,000 on the day we started to 56,000 today. We have less arrests than most medium-sized counties in my state. Our jail audit fell from 7,300 to 4,000, and we actually closed one of the 3 main jails in Dade County. And trust me, our population has not shrunk. Now, usually when people get up and talk about this great stuff, they talk about how much money they saved. That really usually isn't true. It's usually cost shifting and just spending the dollars more wisely, unless you close the jail. That's real savings, because as long as there's no bodies, electricity, liability, and salaries, money is saved. And for us, it was $12 million a year. It's been closed for 6 years, $72 million worth at this point of real money saved. And I'm going to tell you how I got some of it back in a minute. Because that's what you have to do. You have to reinvest those savings. You just can't steal it and cut taxes. You got to make it work. But we also realized pre-arrest wasn't enough. We needed to have a post-arrest system. And so what we did is we changed the assessment tool the jail was using, got them to use a validated tool, started screening every single person for a serious mental illness when they came in. And if they came in on a misdemeanor, within 3 days of their arrest, they are diverted to one of our crisis stabilization units. And because they have a criminal hold, we reset the case 14 days later, not 72 hours, which doesn't do a lot of good. And we give the individual an opportunity to stabilize. Someone from my staff then goes and visits them at one of the facilities where they're being held and works to convince them to take our program. And if they accept our program, they do not get rebooked. They get picked up at the facility, driven directly to the courtroom where one of my 8 peers are waiting for them. I have a staff of 25 now, and 8 of them are peers, and they are the secret sauce of our recipe. They are amazing because one of the problems we found is that so many people with serious mental illnesses, by the time they get arrested, they also have clinical depression on top of their serious mental illness. And it's not that they don't want to get better, they just don't care anymore. And the peers help reestablish relationships and incentivize them to want to get better. And my county is amazing. They gave us a car. And so when they get to court, we have clothes, food, and medication right there in court for them. And then they're driven to where they're going to sleep that night. And then they're case managed, and they're put on a separate docket, and we watch them get better. The recidivism rate, we started just with misdemeanors, dropped from 72% to 20%. The state attorney couldn't believe what a great public safety improvement this was. That's how you fight crime. She then allowed us to expand it to nonviolent felony cases, which we've been doing for almost 5 years. The recidivism rate is about 25%. That program alone has saved the county 31,000 jail bed days. That's 83 years of jail bed days just by getting people out, treated, and reducing recidivism. But we found that there were other collateral pieces that we had not even anticipated. And one went to our police officers, who we have dearly overlooked and took for granted in ways we never should have. And that's the impact trauma has on them. So, you know, you're sitting around right now, you have this little thing called the pituitary gland. Why is this judge talking to me about my pituitary gland? Well, it's critically important in our business. It's your warning system. And so if you're exposed to some horrible trauma, if you're a law enforcement officer, or a little girl getting assaulted, or a boy living in a domestic violence home, or a soldier at war, your pituitary gland sends a little message to your adrenaline. Your adrenaline releases a chemical called cortisol, and it's your flight or fight mechanism. And if you can't get away, and if you're a law enforcement and you have to stay and face the danger, you get overdosed with cortisol. And cortisol permanently alters brain activity. It is a physiological reaction. It is not emotional. It's no different if you broke your arm. You can't shake it off. It's a break in the brain. And it explains why my CIT coordinator gets 150 calls a month from police officers for their own personal mental health issues. It explains why last year more police officers died from suicide than in the line of duty. It explains why officers have some of the highest suicide, domestic violence, substance use, and divorce rates of any profession, because they are walking around with terrible PTSD, and we have ignored it. So what did we do? We set up a separate track of treatment outside their departments, because we all know the last place they're going to go for help is their own department, for all the obvious reasons. Now they come to my CIT coordinator. She hooks them up with treatment outside the department, and they have become so empathetic. I believe that's why we have 149 arrests out of 84,000 plus calls, because they get it. And they're getting better too. Because this isn't a criminal justice problem, this is a health issue. $200 billion was spent in the United States on depression last year. We're just applying the wrong model. And until we start applying a disease or a population health model instead of a criminal justice model, this will not get better. So there's several things that we need to do. There are several what I call essential elements a community needs to improve its system. One is we have to have early identification, because I want to go back to trauma a minute. 92% of all the women in jail and prison in the United States with a serious mental illness were sexually abused as a young child, 6, 7, 8 years old. Do the schools embrace them? Do they figure out why they're misbehaving? No, they stick them in a class with other misbehaving children, and nothing changes. Every pediatrician and every teacher in the United States needs to be trained on how to screen for trauma. And I said if we were going to do this again, I'd have a 3-part: pre-arrest, post-arrest, and early identification. We need good diagnosis, which means good doctors. These are not easy illnesses to get right, and all the treatment has to be co-occurring. Almost 75% of the people that get arrested with a serious mental illness have a co-occurring disorder of substance use. We need to use medical homes, so when people go to a primary health doctor, they also get a psychiatric checkup. You have to have a coordinated criminal justice response like we discussed. One of the other programs that we developed was a alternative to competency restoration. We call it MD-FAC, Miami-Dade Forensic Alternative Center. We take people on felonies, nonviolent, who cannot be restored in the community, who otherwise would have gone to a restoration facility. We keep them in a local locked program, and instead of focusing on restoring them so we could watch them get credit time served, because I guess I didn't finish the story, for 80% of the people that we restore in Florida, 3 things happen to them. They either get the charges dropped, credit for time served, or probation, and they leave the courthouse without any access to care after we just spent 25 to 30% of the state's entire mental health budget. You know, that's the definition of insanity, right? Where you keep doing the same thing again and again and expect a different outcome. So we have an alternative program. Instead of focusing on restoration, we focus on community reintegration. And then once they are stable enough, they go into our felony diversion program. The court monitors them for another year, and in most cases, the charges are dropped and they don't come back. The recidivism of that program is almost at 1%. It is mind-boggling how well it works if you get people the kinds of treatment they need. We need trauma-related service. We need good, meaningful day activities. Sending someone to an adult living facility to watch Dr. Phil is not good, meaningful day activities. The brain is the brain. It has to stay active. People have to have a will. They have to have a reason to get up every day, whether you have a mental illness or not. That's why people who retire often get depressed, because they're not using the part of the brain and they're not getting the blood flow. It's the same with people with mental illnesses. They just want to have a life. We need to treat long-term institutionalization. We need to have supportive housing, supportive employment. We need to hire peers. We use a program called SOAR, which is an expedited program to get federal benefits. We get people their benefits in 30 days for 90% of the people we apply for. It helps, particularly when you don't have Medicaid expansion. We need to look out for the criminogenic risk factors. Just getting people mental health treatment that come into criminal justice often is not enough. Cognitive behavioral therapies may be required for some of this population as well. We use screening tools that specifically help us look for these criminogenic risk factors. We need to use technology, we need to reform our involuntary hospitalization laws, and we need to dedicate resources to these illnesses just like we do on any other illness. Look, the current shortcomings of our community mental health system, our criminal justice and juvenile justice system did not happen overnight. And all of us have to be part of this. I've been a judge for almost 22 years, and the other simple conclusion I have reached is that we are the repository of failed public policy, and none larger than in the area of mental illness. But I am convinced that if we continue to work forward, because I said to you, and then I will wrap up, that I saved my county $72 million and I got some of the money back. What did I get back? I got $42 million back from my county to build the first of its kind forensic diversion facility. In about 4 or 5 weeks, we will break ground. It'll be a one-stop shop for the most acutely ill that keep recycling again and again. It'll be a receiving facility. You can either get there through an arrest or a pre-arrest CIT. And if you're one of those high utilizers, you get to stay. And there'll be crisis care there. There'll be short-term residential care. There'll be a primary health clinic so we can deal with the whole body. There'll be a dental clinic, an eye clinic, tattoo removal, because sometimes people do silly things under the influence and in psychosis. There'll be trauma services. There'll be housing for up to a year. There'll be a day activity program run by people with mental illnesses to teach self-sufficiency. And there will be a supportive employment culinary program so that when people leave us, they will have jobs and have a life. And instead of just kicking people to the curb, once we have adjudicated their case, we will gently and carefully and smartly reintegrate them back into the community with all the supports and services. We feel we've already reached an 80% solution. The building gets us the last 20. And once we're finally able to do this, we believe we will finally do what the Supreme Court asked us to do some 50 years ago when they wanted us to deinstitutionalize. Thank you all very, very much. Thank you very much. But if you have any questions, I'll be happy to take it. Any questions? I know you want to go home. Yes, sir. It's okay. Take your time. I agree. And so the question, if I may, has to do with the trauma to men who are sexually abused under the age of 18. There's an organization, he said, called 1 in 6, meaning internationally 1 in 6 men under the age of 18 are also sexually abused. I said that 92% of all the women in jail and prison in the United States that have a serious mental illness were sexually abused as children. Well, 75% of men in the United States were with serious mental illnesses also have very serious trauma. Some of it is sexual abuse, some of it is domestic violence, some of it is living in a war zone where they see horrible things happen to them. And so trauma is a very serious issue. If you haven't looked at it, you should. Something called the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. There's almost 100% correlation between a high ACEs score in substance abuse and mental illness. And so it has to be addressed. And that's why, going back to one of the things I wish we had done earlier that we're just starting to do now, is we have to start screening at a very early age for these issues. Because like any illness, the earlier we diagnose and treat it, the better the outcomes are going to be. And we shouldn't allow people to grow up with not only the stigma, but of the damage to the brain because of these experiences. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. In fact, a lot of the PTSD among soldiers was more sex abuse than some of it was combat. And it was also against men as well. So, you know, sometimes there's some horrible things that go on in our society. And just because they're horrible, we cannot be afraid to talk about them or they'll never get treated. I mean, look, I remember growing up when cancer was known as the C word, and I would hear my parents whispering about someone that might have cancer. For crying out loud, now it's on the tail of a, breast cancer's on the tail of an airplane wing. I mean, we've come a long way with that illness, and now we need to come a long way with these other illnesses, including mental illness. And I think this is the great next frontier. And I will tell you, I'm actually very optimistic. I have a relatively conservative legislature in Florida, and for the first time, they're ready to tackle a lot of these issues. And it's only because I think we've been persistent, but also we're showing them that if they really want to save money and get better outcomes, we need to address these mental health issues. So thank you for your issue.